Thank you very much, Meryem, and thanks to all the speakers. I guess, sorry, we're just swapping identities. I guess I'm not going to speak for long, just a couple of things. One of the common themes is that the formal structure to protect women's rights, both of the person and obviously of assets, international, national and locally, obviously in most of this work doesn't come out very well. It's customary law that seems to be holding sway, and also a sense that it's a degraded or increasingly degraded form of customary law and of those power structures at the local level. And at one level I think that probably wouldn't surprise us, because we know that pressure on land-based natural resources, other resources will grow, and the tendency for people to be predatory at these sort of key life-changing events, kind of divorce, an inheritance, either from a spouse, a dying spouse, or a parent, is likely to grow. But there are various drivers for that, including, you know, the different ways in which land-based natural resources are being valued, biofuels, etc. So we can anticipate that those pressures will grow. So there seems to be urgent issues here to understand what can be done that can really strengthen women's capacity to claim and hold resources at these key life change events and even at other times. I guess one thing, just a quick comment that I haven't heard much in the material, is about sort of urban and peri-urban as against rural, and how women's assets in those different environments are playing out, especially given urbanisation in this context. But thanks very much to the four speakers. Just a few points on the discussion. Please keep it to 1 point. It doesn't have to be a question. It's not Q&A. It can be a comment. But try and keep it brief so that lots of people have the chance to contribute. Please wait for the mic, which Liam has got at the back. Introduce yourself. And we do have some people online who may be sending in questions. So if we get some of those, we'll make time for that. And for anyone watching online, please feel free to contribute in that way. Before we move to the general discussion, do any of the other researchers who've been here for yesterday's discussion have something urgent that they want to say about their findings in relation to that? I know there are several other people who've been working on this programme. Would any of them like to say anything at this point or contribute any comments from their own work? Okay, well in that case I'll give them another chance, the other researchers who are here, later in the discussion. But at this point I'll just throw it open, like I say, for either comments or questions to the panel.
Hi, Sylvia Beals, Hope Age International. Thank you very much. Very fascinating set of observations from the speakers. As you may know, from where I work, we're very interested in issues of older women as well as older men, and the gender dimensions of aging, I guess. So I would much appreciate a comment from you as a panel and any researchers in the room about your findings in relation to this gender question. Our own work has taken us into a great deal of some of the strategies that were described, I think, by Fatty in terms of paralegal work dealing with the customary law question, which, for example, results in older women being accused of witchcraft and suffering violence and banishment. I think that was mentioned. And also this issue of documentation being very critical to claim entitlements, and the problems that older women have in particular because of language and access. So I'd be really grateful if you could make a comment, and also something about how we might bring these worlds together so we don't see women in a sort of, you know, a kind of a bag where older women don't come in, or indigenous women are separate, or women, you know, in particular areas of a country aren't sort of included. So issues of age as a cross-cutting issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. Let's get a few other comments before we go back.
Ruth Jacobson of Ruth Jacobson Research. I was looking at the recommendations in the report. I'm sorry if that's taking us away from the speakers. And I was delighted to see that recommendation 5 mentions collective access, collective approaches. But I'm wondering whether this doesn't raise some issues in the current donor and international climate of stressing individual land titling and individual access. And just wondering comments from the speakers on this. I was involved with them in Mozambique with the attempt to get collective ownership for women's and other organizations into the Land Act in the post-conflict constitutional and legal revision, and it was an enormous struggle then, and I don't think it would be any easier now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a question.
I'm Najat Said. I'm a PhD student at University of Westminster, and my question is what kind of resolution of inheritance will be taken when it contradicts with the Islamic law? And my second question, are there any kind of economic programs for empowerment women in donor countries or rich countries? Just to give you briefly of my fieldwork experience that I have done 2 months ago in Saudi Arabia, there are like very extremely poor women in the villages, and to the extent that even the families do not have land to be inherited. And 70% of the villages of the women are not capable to continue their education because of either poverty or because of traditions and lack of transportation. So what are there like kind of economic programs to such rich countries like this? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll take one more question because those are all. Yeah, thanks.
Hi, I'm Simon Levine here at ODI. Before my question, a quick answer, a comment on the question about age, which was research which we did in Uganda actually on widows and land grabbing from widows showed interestingly that older widows nearly always were able to retain their land. It was younger widows who had most of the problems. There are various reasons for that. But the idea that kind of women are all in one group, or even widows are all in one group. Yes. And interesting also that you talked about the problems of older men, because we found also that land grabbing from old men was nearly as bad as from widows, because it was very much around your strength and your power. Being a woman made you weak, being old made you weak, and so on. So power analysis rather than gender analysis was really the way to go there. My question was, how do we solve the fundamental problem? We talk a lot about, or some people talk a lot about wanting to make sure that inheritance is non-discriminatory and women have equal rights to inheritance. In most of sub-Saharan Africa, most land is not inherited. It's allocated to couples on marriage while the parents are still alive, which is not inheritance. If you're looking in a rural context, it makes very little sense to either the man or the woman in a couple to be given one field by the bride's parents and one field by the groom's parents, because you can't possibly farm 2 fields which are 30 miles or more apart. So it only makes sense if your fields are in the same place. So essentially the economic logic of farming and being allocated land by the previous generation is you've got to get it from either one set of parents or the other set of parents. In most of sub-Saharan Africa you get it from the grooms. The couple gets from the groom's parents. There are some places where it's from the woman. But given that fundamental logic that the only way in which it makes sense is for all the land to come from in one place from one set of parents, and it makes obvious sense that if it is the man, it's the man, but we're not going to change the culture and make it the woman. How do we then say that women must have an equal right to claim land from their parents, because you're completely undermining the very logic of the livelihood of the couple as a couple? So that, not in any way discounting the problems which women have with land rights, but unless we actually tackle the fundamental problem, which is passing laws saying that the girl should have the same rights to land from her parents as the sons do, doesn't make sense to the girls. Certainly doesn't make sense to the girls once they're married.
Thank you very much. We'll go back to the panel now for some responses on those questions. Fatty, do you want to start?
Yeah, I just want to respond to that. The issue of older women, it's actually true. With the customary practice back in Ghana, if you are a young widow, you are expected to either choose from your husband's family and continue using whatever property he has got left, or you refuse to make a choice of any member of his family and you lose the inheritance. And you also lose custody of your children. And so most of the times, even the young ones have the dilemma of going to start life afresh or staying back in that family and enjoying whatever the husband has left. The older women sometimes choose to go if they think they can live comfortably outside, away from their deceased husband's family, or they stay back because then their children will inherit from their father and then they will have continuous use of the land. But then what we do at our place to ensure that these women are secured, whether they go back or they stay, is to ask for land from the traditional authority for block farming. And so if it is a block farm, it is meant for the women in the community. And we have put in the mechanisms in such a way that the woman, her daughter, can inherit her. The sons are not part of that block farm, the area that has been demarcated. And so that is how the 120 acres has been given to one group, to 7 groups of women, and they can continue, have continuous use of that land even after the death of their husbands, or if they are currently widows, if they die, their daughters will have continuous use and their granddaughters. So it's just the line of women, and this is to ensure that the women will have a constant use of the land from generation to generation. And so that is what we do to protect the aged women. In the area of accusation of witchcraft, they are banished from that community altogether. And so they go to another community. Right now in Ghana, in the northern part of Ghana, we have about 4 camps that has over 700 women along with their children. They go with their grandchildren, some 2 children. At least the average is maybe 2 children per one woman accused. And so you can also see that these young girls are going to lose out on their education because where they are stigmatized and they cannot go to school. And so this is a generational illiteracy and that kind of progress. It's not a progress anyway, but it's a progression from one poverty to another state, from mother to daughter. And so what we are also doing is getting the district assemblies, our local decentralized systems, to do a lot more education at the community level, because they have the responsibility to educate the people on their rights to education, their security and all that. And so we get into contact with the district assemblies, and a lot more education is done so that these children who go along with their mothers into the witches, alleged witches camps, will continue some kind of education. And so for us, those are the kind of programs that we have put in place to ensure that there will be a break somewhere. Because if the girls don't get education as they go with their mothers or their grandmothers, then that cycle is going to continue. And for a long time, we will have that situation no matter what we do.
Thank you very much. Kate.
The evidence from some of the research that we've commissioned shows also that younger women are more likely, more vulnerable to losing their assets following widowhood. And that's particularly the case if they don't have a son, and even more the case if they have no children at all. So it tends to be younger women who are more vulnerable, and part of that, as I've said, is because of they're less likely to have children, particularly sons, but also because they won't have had many years to build strong and good relationships with their in-laws. So they don't have the social capital in the area that they're now living because of patrilocality. So I think that's an issue that might need to be thought about if there's going to be a focus in terms of age cohorts within widowhood. In terms of collective action, collective approaches and individual titling, there's a lot of evidence in the literature that actually moving towards individual titling, unless it's done very, very carefully, can worsen the rights of women and children. So although we might expect that titling would protect, the way that titling is done often means that the male head of household gains the title, and therefore women actually lose the use rights and secondary rights that they may have had. Where there has been co-titling, so both spouses get equal title, that changes that arrangement, but the assumption that individual rights is always going to be better than collective and communal rights is not borne out by the evidence. And as I said before, what we're seeing is communal rights have been eroded. And if you look back and if you ask older people about how the rights, what the rights were and how those rights were implemented when they were younger, often you'll see that those rights were more protective than they are now. So what we're seeing is, as Andy mentioned, under pressure through land fragmentation, land pressures, increased value of land, you're seeing a jostling and a scurrying and the erosion of traditional practice. So the idea that traditional practice and customary practice does not shift and change is erroneous, because customary practice is shifting, is changing, and if what we're wanting to see is a more beneficial, more equitable change, it's useful to remind people that customary practice is not cast in stone. It does change. And if we're looking to make equitable changes, there are things that can be done that work along with the grain of society to support equitable change. So just coming to the comment that was made by Simon a moment ago, couples can't get land from both the husband's side and the wife's side. Well, that's actually not true, because in some societies, both husbands and wives do inherit land. Sometimes women will inherit from their mothers. So, for example, if a woman has been able to build or secure some assets, she may be able to pass those on to her daughters. And evidence from this set of studies shows that where women have been able to secure some assets, that has a strongly protective function. Even if that land is 30 miles away in her natal home, it improves her agency and well-being, knowing that her backstop position within the conjugal contract is different. So if the worst comes to the worst and she needs to leave her marriage, she can go back to that land rather than being destitute. Equally, if she's widowed, she may not have to go through the humiliation of being inherited. She could relocate to that patch of land. So we have a study that shows that even if that's only an eighth of an acre, a tiny fragment of land, that can be important. So first of all, it's not true that customary practice doesn't shift. And secondly, women can and do inherit land. Even if it's 30 miles away, it can help. Inheritance in Islamic law, this is quite a complicated area. And you can't say this works in one country, therefore it'll work in all Islamic environments. So I've seen studies that look at Islamic law and the overplay of different cultural practices throughout South Asia, and very different outcomes in Indonesia because of the different roots of society and culture in those areas. So, for example, in Indonesia, some very interesting work has been done to Indonesianize Islamic law. So that's actually bringing back in the more equitable approaches to inheritance that have their roots in the more equal Islamic culture. And if you look at South Asia, there tends to be less equality there, and therefore the way that Islamic law is articulated and implemented is quite strongly against women's equity. Urban and peri-urban issues. What we see in urban and peri-urban areas is that land has a much smaller share of the asset portfolio, and instead you're seeing business assets and other productive assets, and also a much greater importance to the value of housing property. So that the assets are different, and that can mean that where land is a strong emotive cultural artifact, that it can actually be easier for women and girls to inherit in those urban and peri-urban areas. There are still barriers and problems, but land is often the block. And at this point, I would like to just quickly introduce an organisation that's represented here in the room. It's called Widows for Peace and Democracy. If you'd just like to wave your hand in the air. This is a representative of that organisation. So if you're interested in talking more about those issues, please go in that direction at the end of the meeting. And I'll just pass over now to the other panel members.
Thank you, Kate.
I'd like to give brief responses on 3 issues. The one is widows and the issue of economic empowerment, and then on communal land registration
I
or
just
ownership.
have a clarification, because
Sure.
I was extremely pleased to see this mentioned very firmly, and I was merely raising the difficulties
That
of actually carrying it through. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, let me start with widowhood. Having lived among the Luo community in Kenya for a long time, it's a polygamous society, and when we look at widows, as we learned before, we need to look at the age range they're in. Once they have passed childbearing age, their position in society becomes, in the local society and the family often changes. So they are no longer subjected to wife inheritance, and they become members of the respected elders. So they're even allowed to join communal meetings where normally women are not allowed. So status changes, and I think it's important to draw attention to. On the issue of communal land ownership, or joint land ownership, not communal, joint land ownership, again, working with a group of women in Kenya, we try to register the land in the group's name. To secure the land, they were working on secure it against interest of, for example, influential male members of the community, like the chief. We were constructing a big workshop complex, and as it grew up, the chief came basically and had an eye on it and said, there must be an office in there for me. So what did we do to protect against that was to find a way. You need to look at, and that's different in every country, what kind of legal entity is there for a group to register in. And sometimes you need to register as a cooperative. Some countries have provisions where you can register as a group. You need to have your constitution that it's recognized legally, so it gives legal identity to the group. And once you have that, you are able to then register the land. We managed to do that for the group. And only then will you be able to protect us as well. So as long as you stay informal or you don't have a certified kind of organizational setting, it's almost impossible. That's the experience we have. On economic empowerment, it doesn't always go along or start with land or land ownership. I mean, there are a lot of other approaches and to it. It starts from training, education training, skills training, to business startup training, to microfinance. So it's, you don't have to have land to basically.
Yeah, but most of the programs that I read about is for poor countries. There are very few economic programs that I've read for rich countries that do have very poor people and very poor women. Like, for example, Saudi Arabia is considered a rich oil country, but when I visited those places, there's poverty even more than Africa. But I read very few economic empowerment programs for rich countries that do have poor people like this.
I think take that as a comment.
Yeah.
Meryem.
Just to help us, we worked with you in Kenya, and I think one of the issues we addressed in Kenya was the caregiving burden that comes on older women, and the time, the economic burden that gives to older women, etc. So I'm saying this just to say that they are not off our radar. But then also I know that we had some discussions with you in terms of older people and social security, especially pension, that is becoming a big crisis in whole of Africa and other developing countries as well, and looking into pension and what kind of pension possibilities, health insurance, child care, unemployment insurance, etc. I mean, it is an that kind of packages. But I must say, I mean, we have later cooperated in Africa with some organizations, Farm International, I think, that looks into, just like in India, that looks into informal, more informal form of insurance, health insurance policies, etc. But again, I mean, it is one of the difficult areas, and we know that people, as they get older and they retire, they become poorer anyway. Women become even poorer. And just to say, it is an issue for all of us. No, we don't support economic programs in rich countries. We are very aware that even in the United States there are very big people, a big number of poor people. And I know that in Detroit, I think half of the population is considered under poverty line now. But we don't support projects there. Yes?
Okay, thank you very much. I think because we're now up against time, I'm probably going to hold it there unless there is anything coming from outside.
We have one brief question.
Okay, I did promise people online an opportunity to contribute. So.
Okay, there's one question from Meryem, who's a student of international relations and development policy in Germany, and she asks, in how far could the introduction and de facto implementation of laws that enable women to inherit contribute to creating peace, for example, in the case of somewhere like Colombia?
Okay, I'm just going to ask Kate very quickly on that one. I'm not going to go through the whole.
I think that's a very interesting question, but I can't pretend to know the answer. Our research has not looked at the association between women's land ownership and either violence or insecurity in any form. What we do know is that women who hold assets have a stronger bargaining position both within the household and more broadly within society, and that does seem to be associated with them either being able to negotiate more peaceful family relations or to be able to exit them where necessary.
Thanks very much, Kate. We'll also pass that email, I think, to Meryem, as it's her specific area as well. One comment, final comment, which is on the collective titling. I think I agree very much with the comment that this is the way to go. Apart from anything else, individual titling simply bogs down in most countries. You don't get very far. Yeah. No. Well, basically, I mean, if you take Klaus Deininger, the guy who's leading the work on land, he's a very passionate advocate, as you probably know, because I think he was involved in the Mozambique work of collective titling. The big problem is some of that tradition has involved a kind of romanticisation of traditional authorities, and that's a big problem, particularly for gender. So we need to get out of that. We also need to think about sharecroppers, charcoal burners, the kinds of people who usually aren't seen as being in the society or the community anyway. So there's a lot to learn about how to do it. But I think just in terms of the pressures that exist on natural resources now in many parts of the world, it's probably essential that we move that way. I think it's going to be more equitable, certainly, than going the other way of individual titling. I'd like to thank everyone. I'd particularly like to thank our panel for an excellent session, and also all of the researchers who've contributed to this programme who are here as well. So thank you all very much, as well as the participants. Thanks.